Supercars' second visit to Taupō was an action-packed affair, lots to talk about on track, a promising start for the new Super 440 format, and a noticeable crowd drop on the inaugural event last year. There's lots to talk about from that weekend of racing. I do apologise for being so late, I was knocked out with a cold and I've only just got my voice back, but I'm keen to talk about everything that went down in New Zealand, so let's jump into the review. Each of the three races felt quite unique at round 3 of the championship, which I think really added to my enjoyment of the weekend as a whole, and a whole lot did go down, so it's going to be really hard to capture everything, but let's go through a high-level overview of how each race unfolded. The first race on Saturday morning saw Kostecki and Payne on the front row. Payne was on pole and he managed to hold off an aggressive and very even start from Kostecki. Meanwhile, further back in the pack, Mostert was having a horror morning, and it got even worse when he got turned around by Tommy Randall. We saw our first and I think only safety car at the weekend from memory, when we had a mechanical failure for Macaulay Jones, and that led to a bunch of chaos in the pit lane. Upon the restart though, Payne had to resist yet more pressure, this time from Cameron Waters, who seemed to have some real pace at the midpoint of that race. But Payne held strong, held firm, and actually started skipping away towards the end of that one, taking the win over Waters, and Ryan Wood getting his first podium in Supercars at his home turf as well in New Zealand, which was a great story. He took out the third step of the podium. Race 2 on Saturday afternoon was the great unknown, because they were back on the super soft tyre, that dreaded tyre that we ran most of the championship on in recent years. And I was really excited going into this weekend that there was some tyre variants to add some variety to the super sprint weekends. Although a few laps into this race I was pretty concerned, and I was reminded that this tyre was a terrible one for racing last year, and it was a bit of a slow burn the start of that second race, but boy did it start to deliver as those first pit stops approached. It was a bit of a race of snakes and ladders. They had no data on how this tyre would wear. The first time they drove on it this weekend was during quali, where of course they can't do race simulations, and that saw a really interesting, pretty much race-long battle between Mostert and Kostecki. Approaching the first lot of pit stops, they had massive tyre wear, drop right off the cliff, leading to Kostecki actually sliding into the pit wall on the entry for his pit stop, and Mostert was very close on the exit. A few laps after they got back on track, Mostert put on a very rude move down the inside at turn 4, some big contact between those cars, actually doing some damage to the rim of Kostecki's machine, but he managed to get by. What was really great to see though was that Kostecki managed to hold on and actually put a move on himself back there at turn 4. A few laps later, he overcooked it though, running into the grass, then encouraged by Mostert off the road at turn 5, but it was already largely out of control, and that's all she really wrote there. Mostert skipped away to take his first win of the year. Will Davison, from memory, I think was in second, and Kostecki took the third spot, getting a double podium for DJR. And then of course we had just one race on the Sunday, albeit a longer one, and we had another interesting matchup on the front row. It was Kostecki once again up the front there, but Anton De Pasquale was also on the front row, a big moment for that team, especially given they had just been announced as GM's next homologation team when Triple Eight move over to Ford next year. It was a big pressure moment. They had some head honchos from GM in town, and unfortunately Anton, I think, maybe buckled under the pressure a little bit, locking up into turn 1 on lap 1. I thought that was going to be one of the biggest stories of the race, but just a few corners later, Ryan Wood and Kostecki had a huge moment going through turn 8. Ryan Wood making a move up the inside, pushing Kostecki pretty much off the road, something we'll talk about more shortly, and Kostecki had a big recovery job, ended up running off at turn 9, as did Ryan Wood, both losing a bunch of positions. That opened the floodgates for Cameron Hill, MSR once again putting on a great performance, although he found himself under assault with yet another bold move by Payne at turn 4 a few laps later, and Payne pretty much went on to dominate that race. We had great battles all the way through the field though. It was still very entertaining, even if Payne had it largely locked down. And in the final few laps, we had Payne take the win, followed by Cameron Hill, who held firm in second, and Chaz Mostert capping off a largely strong weekend for them in the races. Now, would you believe that only captures a fraction of everything that went down? We really did see that hard racing continue in New Zealand. There was so many moments and clashes between drivers and teams that would be here for hours if I were to talk about it all. But I did want to recap just a few key takeaways from this weekend because it really did spice up the championship. There were a lot of people down in the dumps. There were others that have sort of risen from the ashes. So I wanted to jump into some of those stories, starting with Matt Payne. Obviously, he won the first race and the big one on Sunday. And the extra special element of all this is that he got to take home the Jason Richards Memorial Trophy as well. No doubt a prize for any Kiwi driver in Supercars, or any driver for that matter of fact. But for him, it was a really good performance. Matt Payne, when he joined the championship in the main game, at least in 2023, he put on some really strong performances, obviously won in Adelaide, but in 2024, he went missing a little bit, as did Penrite Racing in general, to be honest. But this year, he's finally sort of stepped back into the fore. That team seems to be building momentum. And with Kai Allen in the other seat as well, I think they've got something special brewing at that squad. Kai Allen reminds me a lot of what Ryan Wood was like this time last year. You know, clearly got the pace, but just a little bit rough around the edges still and having a bit of bad luck. I've got no doubt that as the season goes on, he'll start to get a bit more consistent and we'll see him towards the pointy end of things as well. It was a similar story for Shell V-Power Racing. They were also off the radar last year, but had a really strong weekend here in New Zealand. Brodie Kostecki obviously fighting for the win in two of those races. And it was also encouraging to see Will Davison towards the front, despite running that older chassis in the team. All that said, Shell did have a good weekend in New Zealand last year and then dropped off the radar again once they got back to Australia for the rest of the season. So fingers crossed we look back on New Zealand this year not as the high point of their season, but as the turning point where they start to build momentum and hopefully be there in the championship picture at the end of the year. Speaking of the championship picture, we saw a rare wobble for those that we normally see at the top of the standings. Triple A, Red Bull Racing had a bit of a mare by their very high standards, it must be said, in New Zealand. I thought the new format with its limited practice and straight into the competitive stuff would really favor Red Bull, given they often roll the cars off the truck in a pretty good setup window. But it wasn't the case. They really did seem lost, throwing setup after setup at the cars and just not really finding the pace, especially in qualifying. As Red Bull often do though, along with their great drivers, they did put in very strong recoveries in the race that did limit the damage. But it'll be interesting to see if this trend continues with this format for them. But I've got no doubt they'll start to turn it around pretty soon. All right, let's get into the spicy stuff and once again revisit our favorite topic of 2025, driving standards, because the drivers ahead of New Zealand met with Beardo, the driving standards observer, to try and work out where this new line in the sand is following the more lenient approach to stewarding and, officiating the racing in supercars. It sounds like it was a positive meeting, but there were two incidents that I think left a few fans scratching their heads after New Zealand. The first of which happened in that second race on Saturday afternoon. Mostert's move on Brodie Kostecki. I labelled it very rude earlier, and while I enjoyed that hard, sort of aggressive action from Mostert, I was surprised this one wasn't deemed a bump and run. And the reason for that, to set the scene again, Mostert had a big run on Kostecki on the exit of turn 3, made contact pretty much into the rear bar of Kostecki's car, which upset the Shell V-Power Mustang and opened the door for Mostert down the inside at turn 4. Now, the actual move itself at turn 4 I think was perfectly fine. I was very surprised though Mostert wasn't deemed to have done a bump and run. As I said, straight into the back of the car on the exit of turn 3. For me, that's clear contact to gain an advantage. That being said, I think Mostert was pretty surprised how slow Kostecki was exiting that corner. Perhaps Kostecki was deliberately trying to balk Mostert, which is perhaps why Beardo was a bit more lenient. And it must be said, despite the contact, despite the aggression, both cars did manage to stay on the road, and Kostecki even managed to make a lunge at the next corner. So you could argue fair bump, play on, if you were to use an AFL term, but overall it was pretty aggressive racing, and Beardo did label that incident as the line. So with that level of aggression going unpenalised on Saturday afternoon, you can't blame a lot of Supercars fans for being a bit confused Then on Sunday, when Ryan Wood copped 5 seconds for another incident yet again with Brody Kostecki. So how this one unfolded, Ryan Wood, lap 1, got a great run up the inside on Kostecki through the fast left-hander of turn 8. They're banging wheels, banging doors, it was great action. Although on the exit, Ryan Wood put Kostecki in the grass, leading to what could have been a pretty bad incident, to be fair. Now, going back, you could actually argue, if you break it down frame by frame, that Ryan Wood just left a car's width on the exit there, although it's a pretty fine margin, especially when you consider the speed they're going, the fact they're banging doors, and all the rubbish off the racing line. I do think it was a fair call that he did just run him off the road. And that kind of stuff, in my opinion, should still be penalized in supercars, especially when they're so evenly side by side. And the reason why I think a penalty is necessary for that kind of driving is that I don't want to see supercars descend into what we see in F1, where the driver on the inside or at the apex first is almost given a free license to then do whatever they want on the corner exit. In F1, we often see them desperately lunge for the apex or down the inside, sometimes out of control, and then they just run the other driver off the road on the exit. And for me, that ruins that back and forth switchback racing, that last corner after corner, and can be so entertaining for us as fans. And that's what that did rob us off, unfortunately. Ryan Wood pushing Kostecki into the grass. It meant that Kostecki couldn't then race him through turn 9, and both of the guys lost positions as a result. You could absolutely argue the aggression was the same level as Mostert the day before, but I think it was a very different type of incident. And for me personally, I think the penalty was fair. For you guys though, you are in the other way. I had 34 people vote at the time of taking this screenshot, and 71% of you disagreed with the 5-second penalty. So it's definitely split opinion out there, but as I said, for me, I think they did actually get it right in this instance. All right, let's start wrapping up with some bigger picture stuff. I think Supercars should be pretty happy with how this new Super 440 format has rolled out. I was encouraged by it looking at it on paper, and I'm even happier with it now after seeing it in action. I think it's a big step forward for these more sprint style rounds on the calendar. Friday, definitely lacking Supercars action, just 2 practice sessions, but I think that's more than compensated for on Saturday and Sunday and the great racing it sets us up for. That first race on the Saturday on the new soft tyre for 25, that's just good hard racing. The second race on the old super soft, that's more your snakes and ladders racing with tyres falling off a cliff. That one worked really well, surprisingly well in fact. And then on Sunday, you've got that longer race, the more traditional supercars race with fuel also a factor. I'm not usually a fan of supercars with all these random qualifying formats that are very hard to keep track of, but I do like the way this new Super 440 format builds with a top 10 shootout on the Sunday as well. I think that really adds to the energy of that big race on Sunday. I am curious though, as the year goes on, if teams are going to start to work out this super soft tyre again that's used in the second race on Saturday. I'm a bit worried that as they start to get a feel for it again, they'll start going back into that really conservative tyre management style of racing that plagued the super sprint events last year. The fact they can't run it in practice though does give me encouragement that there will be that sort of randomness that we did see in Taupō. Fingers crossed we see that kind of racing throughout the whole year. My final talking point isn't such a positive one, unfortunately. It's the noticeable decline in crowd numbers at the second installment of the Taupō event. Auto Action reporting a few days after the race that it was down 16,000 people, and it was pretty noticeable on TV as well. Lots of empty seats in the grandstands. General admission still seems to have a pretty healthy showing, but yeah, the crowd numbers certainly looked down, and it did take a bit of energy and atmosphere out of the event, in my opinion. And this sets up an interesting predicament for supercars. Obviously, we know they're heavily reliant on government funding, whether that's at a local or a federal level when they do go to New Zealand, which is what dictated them ultimately going to Taupō. The only catch with that is that the track is miles away from any major urban centres. I think it's about 3.5 hours drive from Auckland, which, you know, to do year after year, to then pay accommodation as well in town if you are from Auckland, that's a bit of a commitment, an expensive commitment too. It does seem like a lot of people didn't make that step for the second time this year. So I'm really curious to see how this event unfolds, especially with this second event likely to be at Ruapuna on the calendar, possibly from next year. That one is a bit closer to a major urban centre in Christchurch, so it shouldn't have the same logistical issues, even though the track needs a lot of work to get out to scratch. But I am curious to see how this Taupō events sort of stabilizes over the coming years, and perhaps if they might consider a move to somewhere like Hampton Downs, which isn't so far away from Auckland. Interesting times ahead. Obviously, Supercars relies on this government funding in New Zealand, but when you see a crowd drop that big, you've got to imagine they're asking questions about what they do long term. We won't let that take away from the fact that it was still another great weekend of action for Supercars in 2025. You guys seem to agree. When I asked for your weekend rating, we had 34% of you give it 5 stars, and the majority, 57%, gave it 4 stars. I sort of sit halfway between those two. If I can go half stars, I'd give it 4.5. Great racing, great action all throughout. The only thing that was really missing was some last lap battles for the win, but those things come around pretty rarely in motorsport. Finishing up with some comments from you guys. Pelicans here saying that first corner, especially in the opening laps, is one of the best on the calendar. And yeah, I'd agree with this. When I first saw the track map for Taupō, I hadn't really seen the circuit prior to Supercars going there. I did think it would be a bit like Barbagallo here in Western Australia, that first turn, where it looks like it should encourage overtaking on paper, but for whatever reason, you just don't see that much of it, at least in Supercars. But at Taupō, absolutely, you see some great moves despite it being a relatively short front straight. Perhaps that slower last corner is what allows those moves to happen. But yeah, great action that often continues through turns 2, 3, and all the way up to turn 5, really. The other comment here from Gates saying, while the carnage was a little more tame this weekend, it was cool to see so many names at the front that aren't usually there. Lots of cool overtakes and battles as well. Yeah, on the topic of carnage, we did see lots of car-to-car combat. I must admit, I'm a little bit nervous to see how this lenient approach to racing goes when they get to somewhere like Tasmania, which is obviously not a street circuit, but there's some pretty close walls in certain parts of that joint. We saw a big crash there for Jackson Evans last year. The hard racing approach there could be pretty spicy. I think we might see a few upset drivers and team owners if we do see some of the calamity that we've come to know in 2025. And the last comment here from Jeremy saying, I wanted more from Cam Waters. Yes, he's someone we haven't really discussed. He obviously got that second place on the Saturday, but perhaps not quite the weekend we were all expecting from him after the strong start to the season. I've got good news for you though, Jeremy. He's still sitting second in the Drivers' Championship, not too far behind Will Brown. Matt Payne has shot up the standings to 3rd place, Brock Finney in 4th, and Chas Mostert in 5th. Brody Kostecki also up there towards the pony end in 6th. Driver standings, Red Bull doing their usual thing at the front, Tickford behind them in the 2nd slot, WAU in 3rd, Shelby Par Racing in 4th, and Grove in 5th. But we'll see how all those standings look in just a few weeks' time when we get to the end of the next round in Tasmania. Symmons Plains Raceway, a fantastic and very unique little racetrack that we'll talk more about in my round preview that will drop in the lead up to that event. If you want to be there for that one, be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. I'd really appreciate your support. Let me know your thoughts down there in the comments as well. Remember to treat people like your trackside. Thank you again for your patience on this review, and I'll see you in the next one.